Good evening, I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. On the NewsHour tonight, President Trump kicks off a 4-day trip to the Middle East, prioritizing business deals on the first official trip of his second term.
Despite reductions on some tariffs, trouble continues in the bond market. What it means for your investments and the broader U.S. economy.
And we examine the potential impact of one state's effort to cut back diversity initiatives on college campuses.
It's saying that I don't count, I'm not qualified, I don't have merit, and all of that is not true.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support PBS NewsHour. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
A law partner rediscovers her grandmother's artistry and creates a trust to keep the craft alive. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you enrich your community. Life well planned.
Cunard is a proud supporter of public television. On a voyage with Cunard, the world awaits. A world of flavor, diverse destinations, and immersive experiences. A world of leisure and British style. All with Cunard's White Star service.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. President Trump signed several new agreements with Saudi Arabia today on this, the first leg of a 3-nation tour of the Middle East. It's his first major trip abroad since retaking the White House.
The president met with Saudi Arabia's de facto ruler, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and spoke at length during an investment conference. As Nick Schifrin reports, Mr. Trump also assailed decades of American policy in the region while he sets a new course.
Today in Riyadh, a royal welcome, a rare personal escort by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Arabian horses escorting the world's most expensive limo, and U.S.-made Saudi F-15s escorting the world's most expensive passenger plane into Riyadh. The kingdom welcomed President Trump with lavender carpet treatment, eager for U.S. engagement and believing the best way to enhance it is a meeting of the minds and money. MBS, as the Crown Prince is widely known, and President Trump mingling with leading CEOs and signing tens of billions of dollars worth of agreements. Behind the show, the Crown Prince's diplomatic priorities, including one announced today. President Trump will meet with Ahmed al-Sharaa, the one-time insurgent imprisoned by the U.S. 20 years ago in Iraq, who helped lead an al-Qaeda offshoot in Syria and is now Syria's interim president. He's been campaigning for international recognition and the lifting of sanctions, which today President Trump told business and Saudi leaders he would grant.
That's why my administration has already taken the first steps toward restoring normal relations between the United States and Syria for the first time in more than a decade. I will be ordering the cessation of sanctions against Syria in order to give them a chance at greatness.
That's a reversal from recent senior U.S. skepticism, including by National Security Council counterterrorism director Sebastian Gorka.
I see foreign fighters from outside of Syria being given very senior positions in the Syrian government and being given Syrian passports. That makes me think, is he still a jihadi?
Another Saudi and Arab priority: convince the U.S. not to attack Iran's nuclear facilities and instead make a deal currently being negotiated by Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, mediated by Oman. Also, to end the war in Gaza. MBS has made it clear so long as the war goes on and Israel blocks a Palestinian state, Saudi Arabia will not normalize with Israel. But in the meantime, the U.S. and Saudi deals will proceed, including what the White House called the largest defense sales agreement in history, $142 billion worth of jets, missile defense, and other weapon systems. Also announced today, chip giant NVIDIA will build some of the world's most advanced chips in Saudi Arabia. It's designed to tie the kingdom to American technology and exclude Chinese technology. It was just a few years ago that Chinese President Xi Jinping received the same Riyadh lavender carpet treatment. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia will also compete with China by combining forces to mine critical minerals. And as part of the kingdom's weaning itself off of oil, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia will cooperate on energy. A senior Saudi official tells PBS NewsHour the U.S. is endorsing future Saudi civil nuclear energy. President Trump said today the new Middle East is being forged despite his predecessor's work.
The gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves.
That is a shift away from decades of U.S. regional strategy. It's a transactional, realist approach that Middle East leaders know well and welcome. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
We start the day's other headlines with news that the Trump administration is terminating another $450 million in grants to Harvard University. That's on top of $2.2 billion in federal funding it froze last month over accusations of anti-Semitism on campus. A White House task force wrote today that Harvard, quote, has become a breeding ground for virtue signaling and discrimination. Harvard disputes those claims. On Monday, the school's president wrote that Harvard is nonpartisan and that federal sanctions are an unlawful attempt to control fundamental aspects of our university's operations. Inflation slowed for the third straight month in April, even as some of President Trump's tariffs took effect. Consumer prices rose by 2.3% when compared to a year ago, but that is the smallest increase in more than 4 years, thanks in part to lower grocery prices. Egg prices, for instance, fell by nearly 13%, the biggest drop in decades. The White House says that today's numbers are proof that Americans are experiencing real economic relief. But many economists warn that the impact of President Trump's tariffs will become more clear in the next few months. The FAA is defending its decision to move control of Newark's airspace to Philadelphia. In a statement today, the FAA said that persistent low staffing levels and low training success rates were contributing factors to moving control of Newark airspace last year. A series of technical problems related to the Philadelphia facility have led to dozens of flight delays and cancellations at Newark in recent days. And the air traffic controller shortages are also a problem in Philadelphia, with the New York Times reporting that only 3 people were on duty yesterday evening when there should have been 14. Turning overseas now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is putting more pressure on Russia's Vladimir Putin to join him for ceasefire talks this week in Turkey. Zelensky says he'll be waiting in the Turkish capital on Thursday as he meets with Turkey's president. Putin has not yet signaled whether he will join them. Ukraine's leader is insisting on face-to-face talks with Putin rather than other Russian officials, saying that only he can decide on any potential ceasefire.
I believe that if Putin does not arrive and plays games again, it is the final point that he does not want to end the war. This means that all the promises, sober and clear promises made by the United States, Europe, and leaders of other countries must be fulfilled.
Zelensky went on to say those promises include strong sanctions against Russia. From the U.S. side, President Trump confirmed that Secretary of State Marco Rubio will travel to Turkey this week to attend the talks. Meantime, Russia today rejected the findings from an international aviation body that said it was responsible for shooting down Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 over Ukraine more than a decade ago. Nearly 300 people were killed. The ruling from the Council of the International Civil Aviation Organization could open the door for victims' families to seek compensation. A separate 2016 investigation found that the jet was shot down by separatist rebels who were using a Russian missile system. Moscow denies any involvement. The French movie star Gérard Depardieu was found guilty of sexual assault by a Paris court today. The 76-year-old actor was convicted of groping 2 women on a movie set back in 2021. He received an 18-month suspended prison sentence and a $32,000 fine. He must also register as a sex offender. His lawyer says they will appeal. The case was seen as a bellwether for how French society and its film industry treat such cases in the post-Me Too era. At the opening of the Cannes Film Festival today, where Depardieu was a regular presence for years, some filmgoers said things have changed.
I don't know. As an actor, Gérard Depardieu is exceptional. It's true that he's a movie giant. Now, it is true that before there was a lot of touching. There are a lot of things that actors were allowed to do that now can't do anymore.
Depardieu is one of France's most famous and prolific actors. He's made more than 250 films since rising to fame back in the 70s. In recent years, the actor has been accused of misconduct by more than 20 women. On Wall Street today, stocks ended mixed following that reassuring inflation data. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slipped nearly 270 points on the day, but the Nasdaq jumped 300 points, or more than 1.5%. The S&P 500 also ended higher, bringing it into positive territory for the year. Still to come on the NewsHour, state-level efforts to reduce diversity initiatives on college campuses. Minnesota's fight to address the murders and disappearance of black women. And baseball's Pete Rose and shoeless Joe Jackson are reinstated, making them eligible for the Hall of Fame.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Let's return now to President Trump's trip to the Middle East. He announced the lifting of sanctions on Syria, along with hundreds of billions of dollars in new arms sales and U.S.-Saudi business agreements. For additional perspective on all this, we get 2 views. Vali Nasser is a professor of international relations at Johns Hopkins University and was an advisor in the State Department during the Obama administration. His latest book is Iran's Grand Strategy, A Political History. And Bernard Hakel is professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. And Bernie Hakel, I'll start with you here. The White House is hailing these economic and defense deals that they announced during President Trump's trip, including that $600 billion in what they say are Saudi investments. What stands out to you in terms of what the U.S. says they were able to secure from Saudi Arabia during this trip?
Well, thank you. They certainly were able to secure major arms deals and also a major agreement on artificial intelligence. But I think the American administration's principal goal has been to, and Saudi Arabia's principal goal has been to forge a strategic alliance, because the Americans don't want the Saudis to veer towards China, especially when it comes to technology and AI. And I think that relationship, that strategic relationship, has been very strongly solidified with this visit of President Trump.
Vali Nasser, what about this major development Nick reported on earlier? President Trump's announcement that he will lift sanctions on Syria. He will meet with Syria's leader tomorrow. This is something the Saudis have been pushing for. Does this say to you that Saudi Arabia is influencing Trump's policy in the Middle East? And could that mean other changes for U.S. policy in the region?
Well, thank you very much for having us. I think building on what Bernie said, that what we're seeing is a moment in which a strategic relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia is forging. The president is going to Saudi Arabia after also concluding a ceasefire with the Houthis, in which the Saudis did play an important role. There is the nuclear negotiations with Iran, where although Saudi Arabia is not sitting at the table, it is having influence both on Tehran and in Washington in prodding them towards a deal. And generally what we are seeing is that the United States is actually moving its Middle East policy closer to an axis with Riyadh in a way in which the U.S. foreign policy decisions are reflecting much more what is Saudi Arabia's vision for peace and stability and future of this region, more so than that of Israel, for instance, which we would have expected to be the case.
Bernie Hakel, pick up on that point there. The fact also that Mohammed bin Salman has been calling specifically for a ceasefire in Gaza, right? He's been calling for some kind of credible plan for statehood for Palestinians. That's been roundly rejected by the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. And also Netanyahu carried out bombings in Gaza while President Trump is in the region. Does this meeting, you think, get MBS any closer to his goals for Palestinians?
Well, I definitely think that people in Israel will not be happy listening to President Trump's speech today, largely because of the lifting of sanctions on Syria. The Israelis are very worried that the new Syrian leadership is a jihadist leadership and have sought very hard to prevent that leadership from fully consolidating its power. On Israel and on the Palestinians, also President Trump was clear that while he wants normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, he does understand that the Saudis are not ready for this unless the Israelis are going to commit themselves to to the establishment of a Palestinian state. And that's clearly not on the cards. He did not, though, President Trump did not come out and condemn Israel for its actions in Gaza. He just lamented the terrible humanitarian situation there. And so far has not really exerted any pressure on Israel to stop its attack on Gaza. And that, I think, will have disappointed the Saudis greatly.
Vali Nasser, pick up on that. Do you agree with Bernie Hakel's take?
Yes, I think he's correct in the sense that Israel has wanted to follow up on its initial war in Gaza to finish off Hamas, to occupy the territory, to pacify it. It also wanted to take the war to Iran and finish off Iran's nuclear program and essentially have a military solution for this region. We see that Saudi Arabia has been pushing for a very different agenda, a ceasefire in Yemen, a bringing in Syria into the fold in the Arab world, lifting sanctions on it, nuclear talks with Iran, and an end to the Gaza war with a future for the Palestinians. And increasingly, we're seeing the influence of Riyadh in Washington, that Washington's position is moving gradually more and more aligned with Saudi Arabia. And I have to say also, it is important that Saudi Arabia is delivering. For instance, it did play a positive role in bringing about the Houthi ceasefire with the United States. It's playing a positive role in negotiations between the United States and Iran, and also in bringing Syria into the fold in the Arab world. So all put together, it's not that the President Trump is giving a gift to Mohammed bin Salman. I think this is a moment where Saudi Arabia is playing a much bigger role. And because it's playing a bigger role and effectively, I think it's having an influence on American foreign policy. And to Bernie's point, that's not welcome news in Israel, which has a very different theory of how to move forward in the Middle East.
Bernie Hakel, when it comes to the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, though, previous U.S. governments had they've made a point of bringing up, of showing concern about human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia. This government has not. It may not be surprising, but is that good policy to you?
Well, I mean, I think from the Saudi perspective, the fact that the Trump administration doesn't care or doesn't seem to care very much about, what we call values, namely democracy, human rights, or at least doesn't seem to or appear to interfere in the domestic affairs of Saudi Arabia, is very welcome. And by the way, it's very welcome by many other leaders in this part of the world, not just in Saudi Arabia. So they prefer a transactional, interest-based, realist foreign policy. And of course, that's something that they did not like about the first 2 years of the Biden administration, and certainly some aspects of the Obama administration, where U.S. foreign policy played on the issues of values, or at least invoked values. This was also true, by the way, for the George W. Bush administration with the neocons, who were criticized by President Trump today. So the Saudis are definitely happier with this approach to American foreign policy. I would also add one other thing, which is that the Saudi foreign policy now, the way it views the region, is also one that is based on realism and pragmatism. And they see arsonists in the region. They see the Israelis as the right-wing Israelis as arsonists, people who want to use violence and military power, as Vali said, to change the political equation in the region. They also see some elements in the Iranian regime who are extremists and who also would like to use non-state actors and terror. And they very much want to move away from the, let's call it the arsonist view and plans for the Middle East towards one that focuses much more on order, stability, prosperity, economic development, because they cannot diversify their economy. They cannot move away from their dependence on oil without that stability and that order being, being the way the region is managed and run.
Vali Nasser, in the last minute or so we have left, I'll give you the final word.
I think I concur with Bernie. I think this region has gone through tremendous amount of trauma in the past 2 years, and its future is hanging in the balance of whether it's going to be more war or some path to stability and economic development. And I think to be preaching democracy and values at this point in time without having a roadmap going forward would fall on deaf ears in the region. I think the Middle East is looking to the United States to show a path towards stability, and I think that's what is important about this visit to Saudi Arabia.
Vali Nasser and Bernard Haykel, thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
The April inflation numbers show that prices did not jump significantly as President Trump imposed higher tariffs and then in many cases delayed them. But the longer term is still uncertain, and the market response to the back and forth over trade has been volatile, especially when it comes to the bond market. Our economics correspondent Paul Salman explains.
Yesterday, we achieved a total reset with China.
The news this week that China and the U.S. agreed to pause the tariff war was a boon for investors. So anxious of late that the president had already paused most tariffs last month.
They're getting a little bit yippy, a little bit afraid.
Yips, originally a golf term for anxiety on the links. The president was referring to investors in the bond market who buy and sell U.S. government IOUs called bonds or treasury securities. Here's longtime market maven Ed Yardeni to explain.
Well, treasury securities are the debt instruments that are issued by the U.S. Treasury to pay for the spending of the United States government that isn't covered by taxes.
Finance professor Laura Veldkamp puts it this way.
A bond is an IOU that the U.S. government issues, and it promises to pay the buyer of that bond back in the future for the money that it's borrowed with interest.
How much interest? Depends on a few things. The maturity of the IOU, 30 days, a year, 10 years, 30. That is, how long before the U.S. is obliged to pay you back what it borrowed. Expected inflation in the meantime. You don't want to be holding an IOU paying 2% a year, say when inflation is, 5%, since you'd lose money every year. The likelihood the U.S. is going to stiff you and default. But ultimately, the interest rate depends on buyer demand.
If the buyers are really eager to buy U.S. government bonds, they might be willing to take them with a low rate of interest. But if U.S. bonds start to look less desirable for one of many reasons, then the interest would be higher.
Now, there's a key reason for the desirability of U.S. Treasuries, according to finance executive Doug Dashiell.
Treasuries are basically viewed as having no credit risk. No one really believes that the U.S. government is going to default.
Plenty of countries have defaulted over the years, but would the U.S. ever default on its treasuries?
That's nuts. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. We want to maintain the full faith and credit of the U.S. government, and the way the U.S. government does that is by paying off its debts without changing the rules.
So folks don't worry much about default, which is why Treasury securities, U.S. bonds, have long been considered among the safest of all investments.
U.S. government bonds have been a global safe asset since about the end of World War II. And what that means is that everybody trusts that U.S. government debt will retain its value.
So then why would investors get the yips and start selling their bonds, driving up treasury rates that are tied to all kinds of consumer loan rates? Well, maybe they think inflation is going to jump because of increased tariffs, making foreign goods more expensive, and higher inflation would make today's bonds worth less than tomorrow's.
If the interest goes up on newly issued bonds, then the old bonds that are out there that still have lower interest payments become less desirable in comparison to those new bonds with the higher interest rates.
And that concern that interest rates would rise brings out the so-called bond vigilantes.
If you're selling the bonds because you don't like the policies, you're saying you think they'll be inflationary, there'll be even larger deficits, then you're a bond vigilante.
Yardeni coined the term back in 1983 to describe investors whose selling put pressure on the government to change its economic policies.
It's the vigilante. You know, if the sheriff in town isn't going to do the job, then the vigilantes will push bond yields up.
By selling. But in April, there was another driver of the yips, hedge funds, private pools of investor money, which use a lot of debt, also called leverage, to make their investments.
A bunch of financial institutions, like hedge funds, had used U.S. government bonds as collateral, meaning I'll lend you some money, but if you don't repay me back, I'm going to get those bonds that you have, because they're sure that those bonds will still have a lot of value in case you need to collect that collateral tomorrow.
Problem was, bond rates were spiking, so today's bonds were losing money and thus losing value as collateral. Lenders told the hedge funds, we need more collateral. The hedge funds appear to have begun selling their bonds to come up with it.
It's a vicious cycle because you lose money, you sell. As you sell, you lose more money. So you create this spiral of selling.
And so what we see is a rapid unwinding.
And that's what happened with Lehman Brothers, right?
That's exactly what happened with Lehman Brothers.
Which back in 2008 triggered a crisis so severe, the government bailed out the next big institution spiraling down, AIG, and then drenched the financial system with cash. The recent concern? Because U.S. Treasuries are so critical to the whole system, another potential death spiral a la 2008. Dashiell, who studied medicine before getting into finance and led investments at AIG post-crash, says the fear of a near-death experience always lurks in a system like ours.
The markets generally work, but like your heart generally works. But every so often, in some people, you develop what's called ventricular fibrillation. And that's what a Treasury Secretary fears. Because when there's ventricular fibrillation, there's no mechanism for the body to actually restore the heart to normal rhythm. And that's what happened with the administration. I would say that the pause on the tariffs was kind of like a defibrillator to try to stabilize what was becoming an unstable market condition and a disequilibrium.
And potentially a heart attack of the financial system.
Right, well, death. I mean, when you get into ventricular fibrillation, if you don't defibrillate the person, the person, doesn't get blood flow to the brain and they die.
Well, the risk of flatlining seems especially remote now that tariffs with China have been paused. And yet, bond yields have risen again. So even though hedge funds don't seem yippy, and today's inflation number at least was unexpectedly low, investors just aren't loving our bonds. Expecting future inflation, maybe? A Fed that won't lower rates? Whatever the reason, it will have knock-on effects for most of us.
Anybody with credit card debt, anybody with a home loan, a mortgage, your interest rate is probably dependent on some treasury rate that it's indexed to. So as the U.S. government becomes riskier, as U.S. government debt becomes riskier, it's not only going to be more expensive for the U.S. government, it's going to be more expensive for households that have debt as well.
And on that happy note, Paul Solman for the PBS NewsHour.
Since taking office in January, the Trump administration has targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts nationwide, including on college campuses.
William Brangham recently traveled to Ohio, where a new state law is also targeting DEI programs, leaving students and faculty on both sides of the issue bracing for change. It's part of our series, Rethinking College.
At Ohio University in Athens, spring semester is winding down. Students are getting ready for graduation and prepping for finals.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Junior Kylie Bridgman, one of more than 16,000 undergrads here, heads a Black student organization which helped organize this year-end 5K. But students have not been able to outrun a controversy over a recently passed law known as SB 1, which eliminates all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on all public colleges and universities in the state.
I think that for a lot of students, it'll change nearly everything. And for some students, it won't change that much at all. But I think that it's just really going to impact people even if they don't recognize that it will, because people don't realize just how much they benefit from DEI.
It is about eliminating what has become, in my view, institutional discrimination through the establishment and economic support of DEI programs.
Republican State Senator Jerry Serino sponsored SB 1, which, among other things, also puts limits on scholarships that have DEI requirements, mandates that schools create a system where students can complain about the lack of intellectual diversity, and bans faculty strikes.
What's important today and what's important at Ohio University is our stories, our legacies, our experience, and what we go through.
In February, Bridgman helped organize a class walkout and march to protest SB 1.
It was a really powerful display of unity because DEI encompasses a lot more people than they realize, and the crowd demonstrated that.
Two of those marchers were junior Audrey Ainsel and senior Mia Walsh. Both work at the Pride Center on campus, a center to support LGBTQ students. It, along with the school's Multicultural Center and the Women's Center, will be required to close under the new law.
These centers act as possibility models for incoming students and students that are maybe touring the campus. Knowing that there was a Pride Center at Ohio University greatly influenced my decision to come here.
It does feel like an effort to erase us because the dialogue in the classroom isn't going to change. You know, like queer people aren't going to go away. This campus isn't going to become less diverse. We've always been here. We will always be here. But why do these physical spaces that mean so much to us have to go away? What does that really do for higher ed? And I can't see that it does anything positive.
Since SB 1 became law, it was signed back in March by Ohio's Republican Governor Mike DeWine. Public colleges and universities across the state, including here at Ohio University, have been scrambling to implement the law by its late June deadline.
There are questions about what we're going to do about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
University President Lori Stewart Gonzalez declined our interview request, but has written that while the university is committed to, quote, building and supporting a sense of belonging, we must also follow the law.
The exam is Monday, 12:20.
Edith Deschel is director of the E.W. Scripps School of Journalism at Ohio University. Do you wish the administration of this university had acted differently when this law was coming out?
Yes. There hasn't been a single person in a leadership position at any university in the state of Ohio who has publicly come out against this bill.
Not one.
Not one.
Deschel sees the law as part of a trend, pointing to when the university paused more than $40,000 in diversity scholarships last year after the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision, and the postponement of a school-sponsored Black alumni reunion this spring. She believes the new law will have far-reaching consequences.
Diversity is important, and any attempt like this Ohio law to say that we need to get rid of woke ideology is a direct attack on me and people who look like me. It's trying to erase my history. It's trying to negate the contributions I've made. It's saying that I don't count, I'm not qualified, I don't have merit, and all of that is not true.
But for others at Ohio University, laws like SB 1 are necessary to combat what they argue is a leftward drift on college campuses.
We've gotten away from the basics, and DEI is one example of it. It's not the only example.
Richard Vedder is a professor emeritus of economics at Ohio University and the author of the new book, Let Colleges Fail.
The concept of diversity is a positive one. I have no problem with that. But the notion that that should trump or outweigh other considerations, especially academic accomplishment, be it in the student in terms of academic performance, be it in the faculty in terms of publications, or I think to say, no, we need to promote so-and-so because she is X, is wrong. America has prospered in...
Vetter says schools have gone overboard hiring various DEI administrators. And while he's apprehensive about politicians meddling in higher ed, he supported SB 1.
We should be looking at those who have real merit to get in, and we have to look harder at those universities that aren't enforcing that.
The changes in Ohio aren't happening in a vacuum. The Trump administration is attacking DEI efforts nationwide. The Education Department warned schools that federal funding could be cut if diversity initiatives are not eliminated. That threat is currently on hold because a federal judge blocked it. The administration has also targeted university accreditation over DEI policies.
DEI is not the only problem that higher ed faces, but it's a big one, and it's been a growing one.
And you saw SB 1 as a corrective to
And it's
that.
a corrective. It's a corrective. Is it a perfect corrective? No. But the severity of the problem was, in my judgment, was big enough that it justified taking some risks with respect to that.
College Republicans, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
And student opinion on ending DEI programs is also not unanimous. Junior Aiden Fox is president of the Ohio University College Republicans. He sees SB 1 as helping correct the political bias he says conservatives face on campus.
After Election Day, every student got an email from the university saying that the Women's Center and the Multicultural Center, in collaboration with Campus Counseling and Psychological Services, was hosting a space for students to come in and essentially grieve and vent about the election, right?
Because Trump had won.
Yes. And if you're one of the people who are celebrating after that night, what kind of message is your university that you're paying thousands upon thousands of dollars sending to you?
For Fox, ending the university's financial support for spaces like the Pride Center, which he argues has a left-wing ideological framework, is about fairness to all students.
If it was a normal student-run organization, I wouldn't have any issue with that whatsoever. I wouldn't expect them to accept me into that space. The issue with that is, it is officially a DEI office ran by the school, funded by the school, and I'm paying for it in two separate ways. The first way as a tuition payer in OU, but the other way before SB 1 was I was also paying for it as a taxpayer.
These are a huge part of the Pride Center's history, as well as just queer history.
After the passage of SB 1, Audrey Ainzel and Mia Walsh helped move books that were housed in the Pride Center to a space just off campus at United Campus Ministry, a nonprofit that works on social justice issues.
The fear was that all of these books would just end up in a dumpster.
The organization was home to some of Ohio University's first LGBT groups in the late 80s and 90s, and will now play a role in providing space off campus.
SB 1 has got to go.
Opponents of SB 1 are not giving up. They're undertaking a campaign to try and repeal the law by referendum, a process that first requires collecting nearly 250,000 signatures by late June. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham in Athens, Ohio.
Amid that broad national push against DEI, a report now on one state's effort to close a significant racial gap in this country, the disproportionate rate at which black women and girls are murdered or go missing.
Special correspondent Fred DeSam Lazaro has this story from Minnesota, part of our series, Race Matters.
All the times that I miss my sister and want her included in different things that are happening throughout our family, we always come here. Her niece and nephew have came and shown their Halloween costumes. I just miss her so much.
Not a day goes by that Lakeisha Lee doesn't think about her sister.
She was a caretaker. She was a natural nurturer.
Brittany Clarity was just 18 when she went missing in 2013. She went to a store in her family's St. Paul neighborhood and didn't return.
We knew something was wrong right away because she wasn't someone who didn't talk with her family and didn't stay in touch.
Lee and her family went to the police, who told them to call back after 24 hours.
They told us, oh, she could possibly, have ran away with her boyfriend to Chicago. And I'm just like, no, that's not the case here. We know she's missing and something's wrong. It was really disheartening that we weren't heard at that time.
10 days later, they got word that Clarity's car had been brought to an impound lot. She was found murdered inside.
It was like our whole world was turned upside down.
To make matters worse, headlines about Clarity's murder referred to her only as a prostitute. She met her killer after he responded to her ad for sexual services.
Instead of her being a young girl who was coerced into doing some things that she shouldn't have been doing, they reported that she was a prostitute. They didn't report how she got there. They just reported a label. That was probably the most disturbing piece of the process when it first happened.
The reactions from both law enforcement and the public spurred Lee to action. She worked with community groups, launched a foundation, and helped start Brittany's Place, a shelter for sex trafficking victims.
My name is Lakeisha Lee.
And she met with lawmakers. Years after Clarity's murder, the Minnesota legislature created a task force to study the issue of missing and murdered black women and girls. Its findings were stark, but perhaps not surprising in a state with some of the highest racial disparities in the country. According to data released by the task force, black women are nearly 3 times more likely to be murdered in Minnesota than white women. Black women make up only 7% of the state's population, but 40% of its domestic violence victims. And the inequity is mirrored nationally. Despite making up just 12% of American females, almost 40% of the women and girls reported missing last year were black. Lee was one of the chairs of the state task force.
To ensure that Brittany's memory is honored.
And in 2023, thanks partly to her lobbying, the state legislature voted to create the nation's first office dedicated to missing and murdered black women and girls. Last April, the office got its first director, Kalina Burks. She spent almost 7 years working for Minnesota's Guardian Ad Litem Board, which protects children in court cases.
We need media and law enforcement and victim services agencies to give the same level of urgency and priority to these cases that they haven't typically gotten. You need someone that's outside of law enforcement in order to bridge the gap with the community. I would argue that as soon as the case is reported to the police, that community, victims, families, relatives, they should come to us next. We'll have an intake process.
When a case is reported, Burke says, the office can guide families through police investigations, help with missing person flyers, and provide victim services like mental health support. It will also train law enforcement and collect data. The state's largest law enforcement association declined to comment.
This is not just about policy. This is about lives.
And Burke says the office will raise awareness, with events like the inaugural Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls Day on the Hill last month.
Black women and girls are safe. All of our communities are safe. The power of our united voices and tireless advocacy can and will create a future where every person is seen, heard, and protected.
But the state office isn't fully staffed yet, and it's only working on one case. At the end of last year, there were over 1,200 active cases of missing black women or girls in Minnesota.
I would argue that the reason we don't have more is because the community is unaware that we're out there. The more we get out in community and have the tough conversations and explain the process, that the understanding comes. But the truth is we want urgency around some of this. And so we do have to meet the community where they are.
But there are other potential headwinds now. Lee worries about funding cuts trickling down to organizations like Brittany's Place and about the broad push led by the Trump administration against programs fighting racial disparities.
DEI programs getting cut, no mention of
the epidemic that's happening of Black femicide in the U.S. and they're in a whole political body that wants to remove that does not want to celebrate how far we've come and does not want to invest in where we need to move forward. That's difficult.
Minnesota Representative Ilhan Omar introduced legislation named after Brittany Clarity to create a national office for missing and murdered Black women and girls, but it stalled in the House. And Lee met late last year with Department of Justice officials about the crisis, but she says she's heard nothing since. Still, multiple states have reached out to Minnesota about opening their own offices, and for Lee, there's another measure of success.
I know she would be really proud of me. My sister's life meant so much, not just to Black women and girls who have gone missing, but just how Black women are seen in society. That's a big deal. That's the big deal.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Fred DeSam-Lazaro in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Fred's reporting is a partnership with the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. All right, some big news in the baseball world tonight. After previously being banned, the late Pete Rose and shoeless Joe Jackson are now eligible to be inducted into baseball's Hall of Fame. That's after being reinstated by Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred. The two players were both tainted by scandal. In a memoir, Rose admitted to betting on games, including those he managed, while Jackson and 7 other teammates were banned for allegedly fixing the World Series back in 1919, dubbing the team the Black Sox. For a closer look, we're joined now by Howard Bryant of ESPN. Howard, it's always great to see you. So for the unfamiliar, let's start with a little bit of a history lesson. Remind us why Pete Rose and shoeless Joe were, until today, unable to be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
Well, the reason is because they were put on the ineligible list by Major League Baseball, which essentially means that once you're on that list, it means you are ineligible from being voted on by the writers for the Hall of Fame or being considered by the Veterans Committee, which are the two ways to be inducted into the Hall. And in 1991, when Pete Rose was banned, this rule was put into place because he was so popular that the idea was that baseball believed that the voters were going to vote for him anyway. So Joe Jackson had been voted on for the Hall a couple of times back in the 30s, but in 1936, 1937. But the ineligible list has been going on since 1991, and ever since then, Rose has not even been allowed to be voted on. So today is a day where he will have an opportunity in 2 years to be inducted.
And the baseball commissioner in his statement said that he had spoken to President Trump about this. Trump had been a staunch supporter of Rose's and his induction into the Hall of Fame. Why now? Why this decision now?
I think it's a total capitulation, to be honest. I think it's another example where the president has pushed his thoughts on an institution and the institution caved. And I don't think there's any other way to put it. Why now? What is Pete Rose has been out of the game for a very long time. Rob Manfred has been commissioner for a dozen years now, for more than a decade. If you were going to do this, this could have been done many, many times before. And of course, there's the other piece of it, which is just the pure meanness of it, which was Pete Rose died in October, and after he's dead, now you put him in the Hall of Fame, which has happened before. Leo Durocher was one of the most disliked people in baseball, and he was never allowed to be inducted into the Hall of Fame while he was alive. 3 years after he dies, he gets inducted into the Hall. So there's a vindictiveness that went on there too, but also I think it was a complete capitulation to the president.
Apart from the timing, there are people who say that there, is a compelling reason for Pete Rose to be in the Hall of Fame. He was baseball's all-time hits leader, 17-time All-Star, 3-time World Series champion. Our team spoke with his biographer, Keith O'Brien. Here's what he had to say.
Fans have long believed that Pete Rose served his time. He paid his dues. He apologized. He's now dead. Why not reinstate him? And secondly, he is objectively one of the greatest baseball players of the 20th century, certainly one of the most iconic. You simply cannot tell the story of baseball in the latter half of the 20th century without Pete Rose. He is square in the moment.
What about that? You can't tell the story of baseball, modern baseball, without Pete Rose, and he should be recognized.
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous. I think it makes no sense at all. And the reason it makes no sense is because we have told the story of Pete Rose. Pete Rose has not been erased by baseball. Pete Rose has been everywhere. Pete Rose had been brought back. He had been on the national broadcast. Everywhere you went, there was Pete Rose. Pete Rose is in the national conversation and has been for 35 years. The only thing Pete Rose didn't get was total victory. He didn't get a plaque in the Hall of Fame. Why didn't he get a plaque in the Hall of Fame? Because Pete Rose bet on the game. Pete Rose did the one thing in baseball that every person in baseball has known for 100 years that you cannot do. And even in the case of Joe Jackson and Happy Felch and the Black Sox, that even with those guys, they were acquitted. Then they were banned by the new commissioner, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. And then over the course of the last 50 years or so, there has been at least some scholarship that suggests that Joe Jackson was manipulated, that Joe Jackson was illiterate, that there was some case that he was sort of, he was duped into what he did. And he also, played very, very well. That there wasn't a great deal of evidence that he threw the 1919 World Series. With Pete Rose, there's no argument to what he did. It's the most open and shut case in baseball. The only issue is that Pete Rose got into the Hall, or is going to get into the Hall, because people wanted it that way. Whatever happened to accountability? You break the law, that's what happens.
Howard Bryant of ESPN, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, a more personal take on how the Trump administration's immigration policies have created fear and uncertainty for many communities.
Santiago Campos of the NewsHour's journalism training program, the Student Reporting Labs, spoke with his family members who lived through an earlier government crackdown.
In the 1950s, the Eisenhower administration deported hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants, both documented and undocumented, as well as American citizens of Mexican descent. This included my grandfather, Daniel Campos. He and his family were among those deported to Mexico. His mother was undocumented, but he was a U.S.-born citizen.
Why they would deport us, I don't know. But I know they would deport us. And we should have been, we were U.S. citizens. The powers to be were white. So they could basically do just whatever they wanted with us.
At one point, a confrontation with a Border Patrol agent would lead Daniel's mother, my great-grandmother, to agree to a deal.
The entire time that they had been deporting my mother was to try and get her to be an informant for the Border Patrol.
My great-grandmother did succumb to this pressure, agreeing to inform Border Patrol of the whereabouts of other undocumented migrants. In exchange, she wouldn't be deported any further and would eventually get naturalized. These sorts of encounters with Border Patrol instilled fear that persisted to the next generation. My father, who was born in the U.S., showed me around the colonias, where he grew up. These were unincorporated communities near the border, primarily inhabited by undocumented migrants and their families, with very few resources and in poor living conditions.
This was originally a one-bedroom shack built out of discarded political campaign billboards, but we lived in a community of poor, undocumented immigrants. We didn't experience the wrongful deportations. We still grew up in a community where that was still a very real threat for us, or at least we felt that it was still a real threat because we knew what our family had gone through.
When my father was young, in the 1980s and 90s, the process to cross Border Patrol checkpoints often didn't involve showing papers. They would simply ask you whether or not you were a citizen.
What if one day I say yes and they don't believe me? Because it was purely based on what you looked like. We were poor, we were brown, we didn't have any kind of identity documents that said that we were from here. Mentally, it was a constant threat that we had to encounter anytime we traveled out of this area. You didn't grow up in this kind of a community. You didn't grow up with a similar close experience of the family deportations. And so I think it's easier for your generation, when you hear something like mass deportation, to think, well, that couldn't happen to me because I'm an American citizen.
But for someone who has experienced it, and for someone who lived it, it's not far-fetched that we could wind up like that again.
Despite these struggles, my family has successfully escaped poverty and built better lives for themselves. As anti-immigrant policies surge again, I and many others may need to reconsider how they could affect us. For PBS News Student Reporting Labs, I'm Santiago Campos in Elsa, Texas.
And that is the News Hour for tonight. I'm Amna Nawaz.
And I'm Jeff Bennett. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thanks for spending part of your evening with us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. For more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world. At hewlett.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.